My name is Michael Gallo, and I'm a private investigator. You are most likely thinking one of two things about me upon learning of my profession. Some of you probably picture a charming but jaded gumshoe with a fascination for finding the truth, a la J.J. Gitz from the film Chinatown. Others probably picture a grimy drunkard that preys on the victims of tragedy, promising them a closure that may not even exist to fund my lifelong bender. The truth is much less glamorous. I'm a failed police detective. After making one too many blunders, I opted to resign before my superiors had the chance to fire, transfer, or demote me. The skill set I developed as a detective translated well into PI work, so I joined a local firm in my hometown. The job really is a lot duller than most people realize. A lot of times, I worked with my country's DA office on their less important cases, gathering up information on low-level criminals. Other times, I was a glorified background checker for local business owners. It was mundane as hell, really, but it paid well enough to keep me in my decent apartment, so I never felt the need to quit. Not until recently, at least. 2 weeks ago, I decided it was time to retire a lot earlier than I had originally planned. It's been hard to find the words to explain my retirement, and I found myself questioning my own sanity because of what I uncovered in my final case. I figured writing my story as I remember it might be therapeutic, so now I'm here. A month ago, a woman of about 40 years named Marjorie Holden came into my office asking to investigate a possible disappearance. Mrs. Holden told me that her nephew, Aaron, had been out of touch for over 5 years and that she was worried he was in trouble. I told her to go to the police, but she figured they wouldn't take her claim seriously since she hadn't reported a possible disappearance until now. Turns out, Mrs. Holden was a member of a locally famous family. The Snells were well known in northeast Pennsylvania for their wealth as well as their dysfunction. They owned one of the most lucrative local businesses in the form of the Snell Foundry, a manufacturer of airplane parts that had originally become an industry powerhouse during World War II. Jackson Snell, Marjorie's grandfather, was the man who secured the contract with the US government. He died under mysterious circumstances immediately after the war ended. The death of Jackson Snell seems to have put a lasting strain on the family, and the dysfunction has persisted into modern era. Back to the case. Marjorie told me that Aaron had left over 10 years ago to go to college in Maryland, and he simply never returned. She believed that Aaron might have used his father's willingness to pay for his studies as an excuse to escape the family for good, and that Aaron's now deceased father simply didn't care enough to look into what his son had been doing before he died unexpectedly. Marjorie stated that she had some contact with Aaron after the death of his father, but that she hadn't heard back from him in about 5 years. She seemed to notice my reluctance to accept her case, so she offered to pay me double what I usually received if I made her case my top priority. I agreed reluctantly. I found quickly that there wasn't much about Aaron to be found on the surface. 3 friends of Aaron's from high school that Marjorie had been able to identify told me he had, to quote, gone off the grid once he left town. Marjorie provided me his Facebook page, but that certainly hadn't been used in about 8 years. I called the university he attended, only to find out he had been kicked out for academic violations and personal conduct issues 3 months into his 2nd semester. To the untrained eye, the search for Aaron was FUBAR. However, I was able to discover that the email he used to set up his Facebook account was also linked to a YouTube channel. It seemed that Aaron had developed a fascination with urban exploration, and that he made a hobby out of videotaping his experiences, investigating abandoned buildings, and posting those videos online. His last YouTube video had been posted in February of 2011. I watched the last few videos that Aaron posted to his channel and found something important in his next to last video. To celebrate 2,000 subscribers, I'm going to explore a place with some personal history. My dad owned a warehouse when I was a kid, but he died a few years ago and his business died with him. Thanks to him, there's an abandoned warehouse with my name on it, literally and figuratively. I called Marjorie and asked her if she had been to the Snell Foundry recently, to which she replied, no. The building itself had been condemned after her brother's death, and had been left the building to rot where it stood in the wooded area a few miles outside of Scranton. She gave me a key to the warehouse to go investigate for any signs of Aaron. Upon entry, I found a video camera lying on the floor of the warehouse, which I took with me. I also noticed a message sprawled in spray paint on the window of the foreman's office. They are watching. Creepy, I called out for Aaron after walking through the warehouse a second time, then decided to leave to examine the contents of the video camera. There were a few video recordings still on the SD card, most of which were uneventful. However, they were all videos of Aaron. He had, in fact, been there at some point. The final 7 recordings on the SD card were that of his return trip to his hometown. In the first recording, he said that since he didn't have a car, he would take a bus to Scranton and then hitchhike to the Snell Foundry building. The next recording saw him outside of the Snell Foundry building just before nightfall. He remarked he was worried because he was cold and getting colder, and he had no desire to walk through the woods to get back to civilization this late into the night. He debated leaving and returning the next morning, but instead he pulled out a flashlight and a crowbar from his backpack and made his way inside the warehouse through one of the bay doors to make his way inside. The next 3 recordings were entirely uneventful. He told some anecdotes from his childhood and was very obviously disappointed to find little of interest inside the building. He started his 5th recording by examining the cryptic message that was sprayed on the window of the foreman's office. He was silent while examining the message, almost like he was unfazed by it. His breathing picked up a little, and he made a comment that it wasn't the creepiest thing he's ever seen in an abandoned building. I expected him to elaborate further, but instead the video just abruptly ended. It was a little perplexing, but I figured there wasn't much to it. Maybe the camera's battery died, or maybe he bumped the button. That's why the beginning of the 6th video shocked me a little. It was a video of Aaron breathing heavily inside what seemed like a shoddy bathroom. He put his flashlight down on the sink facing towards him, and then turned the camera towards himself. He was surprisingly visibly distraught, and he spoke in a frightened whisper. I saw something. Like a mannequin or something. It wasn't there when I first got into the office. I know that for a fact. It was literally 10 feet away from me and looking right at me. I had questions. Why would there ever be a mannequin in a warehouse that manufactured planes? Plus, it sounded like it should have been right in plain sight when Aaron approached the office. Why hadn't he noticed it on the video? Why hadn't I seen it when I'd been there? Did the same person that put it there for Aaron remove it after Aaron had been there? I went back to the video of Aaron approaching the foreman's office, and I did not see anything relating to a mannequin at any point. I was horrified, just like Aaron was in the video. I really didn't want to watch the last recording on the SD card, but I had to. I was being paid to find out what happened to this kid, and it seemed like the answer may have lied on this SD card. I was very reluctant when I clicked on the last entry and watched it. The video showed Aaron walking silently back towards the foreman's office. I realized that he had taken shelter in the bathroom of the truck's bay. From there, the only way he could get back to the bay door from which he entered was by passing through the area where he spotted whatever it was. He was completely silent since leaving the bathroom. He turned off his flashlight as he approached the corner and whispered into the camera, "This was where I saw it." He hesitated, but finally turned the light back on and found nothing where the figure had once been standing. He sighed with a mix of relief and fear. He was probably wondering what I was wondering, where it had gone, and how it moved. Something was wholly wrong. He very slowly inched towards the office, knowing he had to pass right through that area to reach safety. It was entirely dark in the warehouse, save for his flashlight now. Night had fully fallen by this point, and what little natural light that had previously illuminated the warehouse via the skylights in the ceiling was completely gone. Aaron crept forward towards the office, and the warehouse around him was entirely silent. Aaron gasped and froze where he stood. I couldn't immediately discern why he did this, but it became clear to me very quickly that a figure was slowly passing by him from directly behind him. The figure was so close to him that it seemed like he and Aaron brushed shoulders. The figure walked into the light coming from Aaron's flashlight, but didn't acknowledge the petrified Aaron's presence. Obviously, this person should have noticed Aaron, considering Aaron was providing the only discernible light source in that part of the building and was breathing very heavily. But he didn't acknowledge Aaron. It was difficult for me to get a clear view of this figure, as the camera was jumping in and out of focus. But from what I could tell, he was just a normal person. He seemed to be wearing overalls, but I honestly can't be sure. Aaron turned his flashlight off once the figure moved to its right into the foreman's office. Once the video turned off, I thought the video ended. It was entirely silent for about 40 seconds. I was startled when Aaron began whimpering quietly after this long period of silence. I'm not fully sure of what happened in the darkness, but from what I could gather, he had moved forward in hopes of reaching the exit and wound up at the door of the foreman's office where the figure had just entered. Aaron's sobbing got slightly louder, but then immediately stopped when a rustling emanated from his right. There was a brief silence that seemed to last eternities before it was finally broken again. "Hi, Aaron." The voice was quiet but shrill, almost like that of a small child. Aaron immediately screamed and dropped the camera. It seemed as if whomever or whatever was in the office had lunged at him, because seconds after Aaron's scream, I heard a piercing screech and the sound of heavy footsteps banging rapidly against the concrete floor of the warehouse. Other than the sounds of Aaron's distant pain screams scattered throughout the next 15 minutes of the video was dark and silent for about 29 minutes after Aaron dropped the camera. Then, the video ended once the SD card ran out of space. Unfortunately, I have no answers for you. I immediately gave the SD card to the police, since this is clearly something much more malicious than just a young man being estranged from his family. I gave the police a statement and gave them the contact information for Mrs. Holden, and then I asked them to not contact me in regards to this case unless I was entirely necessary. Thankfully, I haven't heard from them since. I am obviously shaken to the core by all of this. I rarely sleep anymore. Like I said earlier, I am now retired, but I obviously have no source of income. I can't collect severance checks since I quit my job, but I also find it increasingly difficult to go out into the world to look for a new job. I am hoping that writing this post will alleviate my mind of the suffering I've experienced since finding what happened to Aaron Shell. If not, I'm honestly not sure I can last much longer. In the days since watching the video, I've had my gun constantly on my person, in case whatever it was that came for Aaron came for me next. My constant fear has persisted, and I've reached a point where I've decided that if tonight proves to be either a sleepless night or another night plagued by nightmares of the thing from the video, I will turn the pistol on myself to spare myself from a fate worse than death that seems to be awaiting us all. When I was in college, I developed a bad habit. No, not alcohol or drugs. Something far tamer than those. I developed a habit of sleeping in class. You see, it seemed as though every class I had fell right after mealtime. Breakfast, then computer science, lunch, then general biology, dinner, then statistics. As a result, I tended to drift off as the professors lectured. However, it was an incident that occurred during the last class that finally broke me of the habit for good. Most of my classes were held in lecture halls at the Science Center, a large, multi-storied concrete building with little in the way of decor. From the outside, it looked more like a parking garage or a penitentiary than an educational facility. Inside wasn't much better. A drab, featureless interior full of the same bland, concrete walls and dull fluorescent lighting. Only a small area on the third floor, dedicated to offices for the various staff, had anything that added colour to the place. One evening, after a meal from the student union, I sat in the back row of my statistics course, feeling a tug on my eyelids as the professor droned on down in the front of the auditorium and my stomach digested my dinner. You never notice yourself going to sleep unless you're actively fighting it, and I was not one to wage war on myself, so it wasn't long before I was out, chin in my hands, pen dangling from my fingertips, hunched over a notebook full of scribbles. It wasn't unusual for the teacher to notice when someone was snoozing in the middle of a lecture. Half the time it seemed like they didn't care. They're not paid to wake you up after all. If you're not paying attention, they're not going to suffer a pay cut when you flunk out. But some still take a moment to call your name, try to snap you out of it. So, when I heard my name being called in the middle of sleep's dark embrace, I quickly snapped to attention and responded, "Yes?" My face got really hot, anticipating the laughter of the other students. But the moment quickly faded as I realized I was sitting alone in a dark and empty classroom. Looking at my watch, I realized that I'd actually managed to doze off through the entire hour and then some, and it was already past 9 o'clock. nobody had bothered to wake me, either as a joke out of sheer obliviousness. Then I sat there, wondering, who called my name? I could still hear the voice in my head, leaving me to wonder if, maybe, it had been a dream. But then, the voice came again. It was low, echoing in the empty room. Clearly not my imagination. The auditorium was dark, but I could still make out much of the interior and the empty seats from the smidgen of yellow light that came through one of the exits, especially from my position at the top back row. "Hello?" I called out into the empty blackness. Several steps down and to my left, something shuffled, moving along the row of seats. I couldn't see it, but from the sound of it, it seemed to be coming in my direction. Instinctively, my heart started racing and I stood up, fumbling in the dark to find my books and get out of there. My pen fell to the floor and rolled off the edge of the level I was on, and for the briefest moment, I had the insane thought that I needed to go get it. But then the shuffling stopped and the room went quiet, and I stood, frozen in my spot, holding my breath and feeling my heart beating in my ears. It felt like minutes went by standing in that uncanny silence. I swear the only sound seemed to be the faint ticking of my watch. The need to move, to get out of that room was overwhelming, but some lingering thought in the back of my mind wanted to hear whoever it was, whatever it was, and know that I wasn't going crazy. I obliged, finally breaking the silence by calling out my name again, not with a friendly, curious voice, but one almost devoid of emotion, like a parrot repeating the sounds its owner makes, but not knowing what they mean. When I gave no response, it moved with a brushing noise akin to someone crawling on their hands and knees, then called again. I couldn't hold my breath in any longer, and I exhaled raggedly, my entire body shaking with fear. It was enough, and the shuffling came again, almost frenetic, moving to the middle of the aisle, then up the steps towards where I stood. Finally, fight or flight response kicked in, and gripping my books tightly under one arm, I dashed for the other end of the row, nearly tripping over my own feet. Looking back over my shoulder, the room was still incredibly dark, but there was enough contrast between the shadows and the objects that I could just make out the form of whatever it was coming up around the edge of the desks. It had the appearance of a human being, but its gait seemed more like that of a crab, walking on both hands and feet with its knees and elbows bent and its back arched at an agonizing looking angle. Something about its head also seemed off, the way it bobbled as the thing scuttled, like it wasn't fully attached. The nightmare realized that I was on the move and began scrambling up onto the desktops in a beeline straight for me. As it clambered across the row, it started making this awful gibbering sound with an unnerving excitement to it. Cluck, 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 cluck. I can't adequately describe the noise, but it put the fear of God in me. Any faint notion I had that I was being pranked went right out the window when that thing came at me. I hit the wall hard, bruising my shoulder, and tumbled down the steps toward the front of the room. Through sheer determination, I managed to keep myself on my feet and tore out of that classroom without looking back. Nobody was in the hall. In fact, nobody seemed to be in that part of the building at all. And why would they be? There weren't any classes that late at night, and all the offices and study areas were 2 stories up. The exit to the building was dark, almost as dark as the lecture hall, but I didn't care. I bolted out into the crisp night air, startling several people who were walking past, and didn't stop running until I made it back to my dormitory, where I hid in my room with the lights on, door locked, and shades drawn until my roommate returned. So, what was it? I don't really know. My strongest suspicion is based on a story I learned later while talking about the incident with a grad student who'd been studying at the school for years. According to her, when the centre was first being built, one of the construction workers paving the roof wasn't watching where he was going and stepped on a skylight that happened to be set over a stairwell. He plunged 3 stories, striking the railing several times and landing on his neck, killing him instantly. Whether that story is true or not, I can't be sure. I couldn't find any news articles about construction accidents, and none of the professors I asked would verify it. Nobody else had described experiencing anything like it either. I'll tell you though, after that, I didn't visit the science center after dark, and I sure as hell never fell asleep in class again. Before I start with what happened, I just need to warn you about a few things. Firstly, I'm not all there in the head. I have schizophrenia and have been on various medications for the past 14 years, with varying degrees of success. Each of them helped a bit, but nothing substantial. Electroshock, attempted in desperation for a cure, instead exacerbated the condition, much to the dismay of both myself and the doctors. Secondly, I'm rather craven. I'm sure I can handle normal stuff, snakes, spiders, etc. When it comes to anything else though, I turn into a complete coward, curl into a ball and wait for it to pass. With all that's happened, I doubt you'll be able to blame me. Just trust me on that. Third, and probably most important, everything I'm about to tell you happened after the electroshock treatments. Because of this, I entirely blame the doctors for everything that happened. Before that therapy, sure, I'd see the occasional oddity and hallucination, but afterward, my life became a constant nightmare. Finally, I should probably tell you why I'm recording this in the first place. The short version is, I'm worried about how much I'll be able to tell before they get to me again, and I want to get as much out there as I can. Even if no one believes me, I need to send this out in the hope that someone will know how to help me. The doctors took me in for shock therapy. The day after my surgery, I saw the first one. I was lying in the hospital bed. It was as uncomfortable as ever, but I'd been pretty heavily confined to that bed ever since I got to the medical floor. I really didn't have much choice but to get used to it. Dr. Marcus slid open the glass door and came into my room. Good, you're awake. We need to run a basic diagnostic test. Now, I understand that you've had a traumatic experience. However, we need to get this done, and the sooner the better. So, if you don't mind, can you tell me what you see? Dr. Marcus held up a card with a picture of a pear on it. I see a pear. Are we done? No, I'm afraid not. The doctor's face dropped into a regretful frown. Here's the next card. What do you see? This time, the picture was of a home and family. It looked like it was drawn by a 3-year-old. It's a house and a family. Is this really necessary? I'd like to get up and stretch my legs. Please, be patient, Ray. I guess he thought that using my name would make me feel better. I need you to identify one more picture for me. Just tell me what you see. Another card. This time, though, the picture creeped me out. It looked like a shadow of a person if it stood up. There was no one attached to it, just the figure. It was entirely pitch black with no features, save for 2 tiny pinpricks where the eyes would be. They looked like stars in the night sky. This is how it started, and I would soon come to regard that image with utter dread. I see a shadowy person with stars for eyes. Where did you get that one? I don't remember it from last time. I wasn't lying. This was a test I had taken many times. Each time they wanted to assess how a new treatment or medication was working, they gave me this test. It was easy. I had actually memorized all the cards by this point. But this one was definitely new. Dr. Marcus gave me a look that was unlike any he had shown before. A mix of puzzlement and confusion, and maybe disbelief. Regardless, he made a strange face and looked at the card himself. "Are you sure that's what you see here?" he asked, turning the card to me again. This time, I didn't recognize the card. It wasn't the figure from before. It was, instead, a crudely drawn police officer standing next to a crudely drawn police cruiser. What had happened to the photo from before? Or was this the real photo and the last one fake? I hate asking myself questions like that. I learned long ago that when you live the way I live, inquiries about what's real and what's not real tend to go unanswered and end up running you in circles until you're too exhausted to think. I dropped the thought from my mind to avoid the hassle. Dr. Marcus, however, was still waiting for an answer. I told him something I thought he would accept as a viable response. The shadow was the officer next to the police car. He saw right through my ploy. "It seems to be you may be experiencing some unforeseen side effects. That's why we do this test, to ascertain whether the treatment is improvement or detriment." I had already heard the speech and didn't care to listen to him beat a dead horse. In retrospect, I should have been more fair to him. He really was trying to help. I see that now. I was tired though, and wanted to go back to my room instead of spending another minute in that uncomfortable bed. Eventually he finished his speech, wrote another prescription, and let me get up. I was happy to be walking out of there. My left leg had fallen asleep, but that was still less irritating than the speech I was given. Dr. Marcus opened my door and shuffled me inside, locking the door as he shut it behind me. I didn't mind. I actually liked my room, save for the monotone colour scheme. Whitewashed walls, occasionally interrupted by a smudge of crayon from some loony. Boring. The rest of the room was more to my liking. My bed was far better than the one I'd been confined to before, and I had a single table that sat next to it, complete with an adjustable desk lamp. The table had a single unlocked drawer, which I was not allowed to have the key to. I didn't care, since the only thing in there were my sketches. I liked to draw, and that was the best place for me to hide them so the other residents didn't get at them. They were like damn vultures, I swear, picking at everything, regardless of whether they had any actual interest in it. You may have realized at this point that the room I've just described sounds a lot like a room at a mental institution. Actually, I suppose everything I've talked about so far does, doesn't it? If so, you've earned yourself a cookie, because in the 4 years leading up to my electroshock treatment, I had been living at Augustinian Institute for the Mentally Unstable. That translates roughly as the loony bin, in case you couldn't tell. Prior to those 4 years, I lived with my parents. We dealt with my illness as a family, and despite any preconceived notions you may have, we were happy. Mom would make breakfast for me every morning, and Dad would watch TV with me. Our house was a safe place for me, and I actually had a better time dealing with the hallucinations when I was at home. With me being so messed up in the head, I'm kind of surprised at how perfect my family life was. Then, quick as a wink, that life ended. My parents went out for a night on the town. Heavy rain was pouring down that night. I remember it keeping me awake. Apparently the soaked, cobbled road was a bad match for the tires of my parents' car, and they skidded off into a ditch. Neither one made it out. That's all I'm going to say about it. It's a touchy subject for me, as you can imagine. With no relatives left, I was placed in the care of my physician, the aforementioned Dr. Marcus. He and the other doctors had only one goal in mind for me: get me healthy enough to boot out the front door so they could bring in another guinea pig. Bad news for them: none of their drugs worked. I was carefully monitored for the next 4 years, bringing us back to the electroshock and the events that took place afterward. I sat down on my bed and retrieved my sketching supplies from the drawer. When I would get really bored, it would help to draw something interesting that happened from the day. Well, I had been resting for most of the day, which really only left one strange flashcard to consider. I drew my rendition of Dr. Marcus, holding up the card. When I tried to draw what was on the card, though, I couldn't. I didn't remember what it was. I do now, obviously, but for whatever reason, at that moment, it was as though the card was blank, both on paper and in reality. I laid back in my bed, getting a headache. I wanted the day to end, and so, despite having rested for 15 hours post-op, I fell asleep. I woke up very early the next morning. I didn't have access to a clock or watch, but there was no light streaming in through the barred window above my bed. It must have been before dawn. The doctors didn't open the doors until 8 each morning, so I was stuck in there in my boredom, waiting. I didn't want to wake the person in the room across the hall from me, so I left my lamp off. Instead, I sat in the darkness, just waiting. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something move in my room. I turned to look, but found nothing. As I rode back to face the door, however, I came face to face with a horrific sight. Utter darkness, a shadow in the room of shadows, with 2 white stars coalesced into a humanoid form. The monster from the card had followed me. It had crawled on all 4s onto my bed and was at eye level, just inches from my face. Its white pinprick eyes stared into mine, void of emotion, lacking in characteristic. I clamped my eyes shut and curled into a fetal position. I started crying, praying for it to be over. I could hear it right next to me. It was breathing in my ear. The hot breath emanated from nowhere, as the monster had no mouth or nose. It stayed there for minutes on end, just breathing louder and louder. I almost wished it would get it over with. Then, quickly as it started, the breathing ceased. Only the hum of electricity remained, coming from the walls. I didn't open my eyes for a very long time, too scared of what I might see. When I finally did open them, it was still dark, and the creature was gone. I quickly flipped on the lamp to make sure it wasn't hiding in the shadows. My room was devoid of inhabitants, save for me. I started to calm down, and quickly became embarrassed. I didn't envy the nurse that would have to take my pants to be washed. Across the hall, I could hear someone stirring. I figured it was a patient, but I didn't want to be left in the dark again. I angled the light away from the door as best I could and tried to get back to sleep, to no avail. Eventually, the sun rose and the doors were unlocked. The nurse gave me a change of clothes, clearly annoyed and a little disgusted. I told Dr. Marcus about what happened to me, for no other reason than to let him document it. He was obviously concerned for me and decided to give me some meds to help with the hallucinations. I took them gladly. No way did I want to see that again. The drugs had side effects, but they sure as hell worked. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary for months. I was so relieved after the first week that I actually thanked Dr. Marcus for all he had done for me. The look on his face was priceless, but I really meant it, and he could tell. I think he lightened up on me after that. He actually started taking an interest in my issues and in helping deal with the side effects of my meds. For 3 months, my life at the Institute was the best it had ever been. Then, in a moment of stupidity, I slipped up. One of the nurses forgot to prepare my psych meds, and I forgot to remind them. I didn't even realize that the mistake had occurred, because even off the pills, everything was fine. I still slept soundly that night, and the night after, and saw nothing strange either day. The third day off my meds, however, would prove to be a moment of clarity for me. I woke up to the sound of my door being unlocked. I flipped on the lamp sleepily before opening my eyes. There wasn't a doctor standing there to greet me this time, just the open door. I got out of bed and stepped out into the hall. I turned and closed the door behind me, locking it back up. I looked down the hallway and froze at what I saw. I wasn't in the asylum anymore. I was in... I don't know. I can't adequately name the horror that now faced me. I always pictured hell as being fiery and smelling of brimstone. This wasn't hell. This was visceral. The hall had been contorted into a fleshy mess. Horrible smelling fluids leaked from sores in the walls and blood coated the squishy, vein-covered floor. The doors to the other rooms were replaced with sphincters, and down the hall I could see a figure standing with its back to me. I could hear it sobbing. I tried to turn around, but every muscle in my body locked. Something inside me knew that whatever was behind me would be far worse than what was in front of me. I looked back to the door to my room, only to find that it wasn't there. The intestinal tunnel I was in had overtaken the door. I could see the doorknob in the folds of flesh though. I thought, if I can just get back through the door, it'll be alright. I don't know why. Out of pure horror, I concocted the notion that my room was a safety net. It was a stupid idea, but I tried it anyway. Nowhere else to go, regardless, except toward the figure. That was the last thing I wanted to do. I tried to reach for the knob, and the flesh closed around it. I pushed through the slimy, squishy mess until I felt my knuckles touch the knob, and I took a hold of it. The wall clamped down on my arm, crushing bone and trapping me there. The figure stood and turned to walk toward me, still sobbing. Its pitch-black skin was broken only by the pinprick white eyes, which leaked a grey fluid that oozed down its cheeks. The sobbing grew louder and louder, becoming like a banshee's wail, somehow echoing off the twisting walls of flesh. It stood perfectly still a few feet from me, and the grey slime continued to dribble out. My crushed arm felt like it was on fire, and my blood sloshed to the floor, mixing with the gore. I started crying out for help, and inside, I was praying that this was a dream or vision. Then, for the first time, the monster spoke. A horrible, ghastly, grating voice. It was utterly inhuman, and that alone gave me strong goosebumps over my entire body. There was no movement of its face, as it had no mouth with which to speak. This made the sound all the more horrible. But it was what the creature said that was truly terrifying. We are in you now, and you are in us. Neither can escape, and you cannot stop us now. My knees gave out, and I dropped to the floor, sloshing the various fluids where I hit. I started bawling, waiting for whatever horrible things the shadow had planned for me. I felt warm hands on my shoulders, and I flinched, cringing away from the evil being that had caught me in this web of sinew. It spoke again. "Ray? Are you with us? Ray?" I looked up to find Dr. Marcus holding my shoulders, trying to help me. The hallway was normal again, as was my door. My arm had healed. Dr. Marcus pulled me to my feet, but I was still unable to stand well, and I was crying my eyes out as he helped me to his office. It was more than an hour before I calmed down enough to tell him what happened. I spared no detail, watching as his face switched between visages of horror, disgust, concern, and outright fear. These looks made me more frightened, because this was the only time I ever saw Dr. Marcus afraid of what a patient reported seeing. He made certain that the nurses never forgot my meds again. They didn't work anymore though. I don't know why. I was really scared of this though, because I was still hallucinating. Flames in the hallway, meals made of maggots, and the damnable creatures that stalked me in the darkness out of my room. Once they realized that nothing was helping anymore, they had no choice but to cast me out. I couldn't benefit from their type of help anymore, and they needed the space. I went back to the home I knew before. It's been 27 days, and each day the visions get more and more intense. The starry-eyed shadows have been following me everywhere. The only place they can't reach me is in my home. They've gotten more creative since the asylum. Everywhere I go, the scenery and people turn into fleshy piles and shadows, all in the blink of an eye. Sometimes the people wouldn't be shadows, but instead twisted, mutilated corpses. It doesn't stop there. If I try to go anywhere, they corner me, cut me open, burn me. I feel everything. The agonizing pain of mutilation is torture, literally. I can't go anywhere. I'm starting to run out of food. I don't trust canned foods at all anymore. It's like a goddamn game of surprise. What's inside this time? A bunch of eyes? Strands of hair? The distortions have invaded my home. Even now, the walls in my room are pulsating like a heartbeat, and the TV only shows static. I don't think anyone will believe me, and I'm scared to go outside. They have surrounded me. I think they are waiting for me to leave. I used to see him often. Well, I guess I shouldn't say him, more like it. Then I moved away to another state, another city. I don't see it anymore. Not physically, though it creeps through my mind in its swooping, slinking way. High up in the air one moment, then sliding across the ground the next, over and over and over, its limbs propelling it forward. The mere thought sends ice-cold shivers running down my spine. It used to watch me, but it can't anymore. At least, I don't think it can. I wouldn't be surprised, however, to wake in the early hours of the day when the sky is still dark and look to my window to see those eyes, those teeth. See it smile, that awful smile. I hope I'm dead before that day arises. I hope I've seen the last of that monster. When I was little, I lived in a small suburban neighborhood. It isn't the kind you're probably thinking of. Big, white uniform houses, all lined up in perfect rows with green lawns and 2 garage doors. No, my neighborhood was much older. It was built sometime in the 50s, and every house looked different. But most had started to fall apart. The people living there were hardworking and honest for the most part, and their long, hard lives showed on their faces. No one really talked to anyone else. That was one of the only things I didn't like about that neighborhood. My mother always said the neighbors just liked to keep to themselves, that they had nothing very important to say anyway. Looking back on it now, I think they did have something important to say. Something very, very important. I saw it for the first time when I was 8 years old, during the summer. It was very hot that season, unusually so compared to all the summers I've had since then, so I'd stay inside most of the morning. Then, after lunch, my father hooked up the sprinkler we used for our garden in our backyard. I excitedly got into play clothes and rushed outside, into the blinding sun. Those were the days. Those innocent days in the sun where I played without a care. I had no idea I would soon be missing them. So, I was outside, running and laughing and jumping through the cool spray of water, when I saw it. At first, I didn't notice it. It was just a rustle in the bushes. Then, it was the crack of a branch, and I looked up. Something dark moved through those leaves. Something as black as midnight, yet it shimmered when the sun hit it. It ran, or galloped, to this day I'm still not sure what to call it, from a small forest behind my house, leapt over my neighbor's fence, and disappeared from my view. I was curious, so I chased it. The pavement burned my feet, but I didn't care. I watched, along with a few other neighborhood children, as the creature swept in and out of the shadows of trees, making its way down the street. It was large, probably about 8 feet tall if it stood upright, though it never did. Instead, it stayed hunched over, its hind legs curled up at its sides, the knees protruding grotesquely past its torso. Large, white, curled claws grew from bony feet and long, slender fingers. Its arms were gnarled, the joints bulging under twisted muscle and skin that was black and rubbery, stretched thin over whatever bones the beast had. It caved in at odd places and almost looked as if it were rotting. Still, when it crept through the sun, patches glistened grey and blue, as if it were made of some kind of foreign glass. Then there was its face. The skin was the same, stretched over an oblong oval skull that jutted out in the back. Its eyes were sunken deep within its head, large and round and hollow. They glowed a weird white yellow, one I'm sure doesn't have a name to this day. Really, it wasn't even glowing. It was more of a pulsating, ever-present light that seemed to come straight from some non-existent soul deep within the monster's core. It always seemed to smile. Its mouth was stretched like its skin, far across its face. You know the expression, grinning ear to ear? It was literal in this case, each corner reaching each side of its face, where ears would have been if it had any. Within this smile were 2 rows of pure white teeth, long and sharp. In fact, each tooth was so long it could never close its mouth. The sharp tips just clacked against each other as it skulked around, waving its head slowly from side to side, as if sniffing something in the air. I used to find this silly, since it had no nose. Now, the thought terrifies me. We kids just watched it in a sort of dazed amazement, never having seen something like it before. I suppose I thought it was just some species I'd yet to learn about in school. I wish that's all it had been. Then our parents called us back inside for dinner, and we grudgingly obeyed, not wanting to get in trouble. I'm not sure about the other kids, but I never quite forgot about the creature I'd seen. I got preoccupied with other things, sure, but its image was always in the back of my mind, burning there, waiting for me to remember it late at night while I tried to drift off to sleep. It got its wish. That night, I was laying in bed with my covers pulled up to my chin, despite how hot I was. The nightlight across the room barely gave me comfort from the thoughts of ghouls and ghosts hiding in my closet or under my bed. Then, the beast's image slipped into my thoughts. I gripped the covers. It hadn't scared me before, yet I'd been mere feet away from it. But now, after having the image sit in my mind all day, my brain registering its unworldly appearance, I started to fear it. It was bad. I knew that now. Then, I heard a tap. I froze. Another tap. I didn't dare move. Then, there was another and another and another. It was at my window. I could hear its long claws scrape across the glass, hear its razor-sharp fangs as they clicked together. I could hear its breathing, heavy, husky, in and out, in and out. Finally, I could no longer bear it. I tore my eyes from the nightlight and gazed through the dark room towards my window. It smiled when it saw me, an impossibly huge grin that split its face in two. White teeth glistening with saliva, gleaming eyes seeming to pull every fear from my conscious and unconscious to the surface. I screamed. By the time my parents rushed into my room, it was gone. No traces of its existence left behind. They said it was just a nightmare. It wasn't just a nightmare. I never saw it in the daytime again, but I saw it every night. After a week, I stopped screaming. I just cried silently in my bed. Then, after another week, I stopped crying. It knew I was scared. I wasn't going to give it the satisfaction of seeing me tremble. It wasn't until I found the lock on my window that I was truly terrified. I'll never forget the clunk the lock made when it had moved for the first time in years, or the waning screech of the window as it slid open, or the heavy breathing at my bedside. I'll never forget those eyes as they gazed at me from beyond my covers. It knew I was scared. It thrived on that. It wouldn't leave me alone. Everyone says I went crazy, but I didn't. It just wouldn't leave me alone. I hardly ever slept. My hair started to fall out, and I always looked tired. My parents put me here, in this psychiatric hospital. It's a nut house, that's what it is. I'm not crazy. It's been years and years. The nightmares still happen when I do sleep, so they keep me here. I suppose I like it better this way though. After all, the monster can't get me here. You know, the funny thing is, I can't even remember where I used to live. I can't remember the state or the city. I can't even remember the country. All humans are driven by their curiosity. There is always a desire in our minds to explore the unknown, the mysterious, and get an adrenaline rush out of it. As for me, I get my adrenaline rush from urban exploration, which involves exploring structures that have been abandoned and left to rot at the mercy of Mother Nature. Urban exploration is pretty popular nowadays, thanks to the internet. If you're an urban explorer with a YouTube account, there's a good chance that your videos will become viral. Exploration of abandoned places always has its dangers. These dangers include collapsed floors and ceilings, police, gang fights, toxic mold, and carcinogenic fibers from old insulation. There are, of course, reports of paranormal activity in some of these places, which makes sense as some of these places have a very dark and disturbing past. I myself had a run-in with the paranormal a few months back. At my university, I'm currently enrolled in a cinematography class to pursue my degree in film production. For Halloween, my instructor, Mr. Anderson, had assigned a Halloween-themed project. Our project was to simply create a scary short film. As a result of my hyperactive imagination, I came up with the idea of filming something that was terrifying in real life. I wanted to go ghost hunting at a haunted location, catch something scary on camera, and blow the other films from my fellow students out of the water. All of the places I explored up to that point had zero paranormal activity, but I figured my latest destination could change that. At the edge of town, on a giant hill, stands a complex of buildings that was once a lunatic asylum. There is no modern feel to its appearance. When you gaze upon the massive stone towers, you feel like you are right in the middle of a horror game. I'll present a bit of history, but I'll try not to bore you with the numerous details. The asylum was constructed in the late 1800s under the Kirkbride plan created by Thomas Kirkbride. Kirkbride believed that the insane should be offered large rooms, fresh air, and sunshine to cure them of their illness. The asylum was meant to be a safe, comfortable place for the mentally ill, but it eventually became hell on earth for its patients. According to federal investigators, There were reports of patients breaking out of their rooms and going on murderous rampages, killing any staff members in their way. Suicide was common there, as some people hung themselves from the ceiling with bed sheets, while others dipped their heads in pots of boiling water stolen from the kitchen. The torture of innocent patients became the norm, and some were restrained for so long that their skin grew over the restraints. Some patients were forced to sit in baths of boiling hot or freezing cold water for hours on end. Some patients underwent lobotomies. In a lobotomy procedure, an ice pick would be shoved through the patient's eye socket and the frontal lobe would be disconnected from the rest of the brain. Some patients would become crippled, while others would be reduced to non-responsive vegetables. The place was eventually closed in the 1980s due to abuse and neglect. With the amount of security swarming the place, it's almost impossible to break in. But the few teenagers who succeeded in doing so have told all kinds of crazy stories, like slamming doors, floating heads, glowing eyes, moving wheelchairs, and disembodied screams. One of the hallways in the building has been nicknamed the Shadow Hallway, because shadowy apparitions supposedly roam this hallway. As much as I wanted to explore the place, I didn't want to be an idiot and face charges for trespassing. Luckily, my best friend, Dennis, is the sheriff's son, so I asked him to pull a few strings for me, and it worked. The razor wire gate at the entrance was unlocked for both of us, and I had the sheriff's note of permission in my pocket in case we were confronted by a security guard that didn't get the memo. Dennis came with me because we partnered up for the project. Being a history buff like me, the chance of exploring an abandoned institution over 100 years old was too good of an opportunity to pass up. He researched the history, just like I did, and printed a copy of the old campus map off the internet, so we would know which building was which. We decided to explore the main hospital building first since it was massive compared to the other buildings. Once we were inside, we were absolutely blown away by the condition of the interior. The inside was in near perfect condition, as if it was closed yesterday. Thanks to the efforts of the police, nobody had a chance to vandalize or spray graffiti on the walls. The ceiling hadn't collapsed, which was a blessing because I didn't want wet pieces of rust to fall on my neck. The only damage we would find was some peeling wallpaper. Everything inside was left behind when the hospital closed. Wheelchairs, beds, syringes, gurneys, medical equipment, and papers were scattered in almost every room. After a half hour, we found the electroshock therapy room, where many patients met a painful demise, as they were often given high levels of electric current that their bodies could not handle. Dennis pointed at the wall. "Dude, look!" I looked at the wall. Attached to the wall were two thick electric cords. Dennis glanced at me and grinned. All of the money in the world wouldn't convince me to plug my arms into those. "No kidding," I replied. We left the therapy room and started walking down yet another dark hallway. The building was literally like a giant maze. We both saw it at the same time. A giant dark shadow rose out of the floor. Its glowing green eyes flashed like headlights as it stared at us. My hands were shaking with excitement as I pointed my camcorder straight at the thing. It eventually turned its head away from us and sank back into the floor. "Did you get that on camera? Please tell me you got that on camera," Dennis exclaimed. I smiled. "Sure did." Dennis high-fived me. "We are going to ace this project now. Our film will be the best in class." right at that moment, my camcorder shut off. I clicked the on-off switch multiple times with no response. I can't believe this. What? The battery died. This doesn't make any sense. I just charged it right before we left. Dennis shrugged. Could be ghosts. Plenty of paranormal investigators have reported the same thing happening to their electronics. Plus, we got that ghost on camera, so we're still going to beat the other projects by a landslide. That's a possibility, and we still have the whole complex to explore for the night. The dead battery can't stop us. Eventually, we found ourselves in Ward D, where the most violent female patients were kept. On each side of the hallway, the patients' rooms had thick wooden doors with giant brass locks on them. And that's when it happened. Without warning, every single door simultaneously slammed shut with a series of loud bangs. We froze. It appeared. There wasn't a flash of light, no misty fog, no stuff like that you see in cheesy horror movies. She just appeared out of nowhere. She was wearing a simple white hospital gown. Her skin was as white as a skeleton. Her eyes had no pupils, no irises, no veins. They were just empty white circles. A few wisps of blonde hair stuck out of her head at random angles, like strands of hay on a broom. She spoke. Why are you two here? You're here to watch me suffer, aren't you? Despite her terrifying appearance, her voice was smooth and sweet, dripping with honey as she spoke. We stood still, frozen with shock. She continued. Doctors, both of you told me that you wanted to cure me so that I could return to society. But you were lying. I knew you were lying. Every time you locked me in an empty room, and every time you shocked me and burned my flesh, I saw that wicked look of glee in both your eyes. You didn't want to kill me. I was just an experiment to you, a guinea pig for you to toy around with. Eventually, you two got bored of me, so you wanted to have one last experiment. While I was fully conscious, you strapped me to an operating table. You wanted to slice my brain to pieces and watch me scream in the process. You wanted to kill me the most painful way possible and enjoy my attempts to break free from the straps. You succeeded. My eyes wandered to her hands, and I saw the object she was clutching in her right hand. It was an ice pick. She noticed me looking at the pick and smiled. As she smiled, her face stretched itself apart like bubblegum. She spoke one more time. You see, doctors, all I want is a little revenge. Is that too much to ask? Her mouth then opened into a large, gaping hole as she unleashed the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard in my life, and I hope to never hear it again. It wasn't just your ordinary scream. Her scream entered my head, and it occupied all of my thoughts. It stirred up all of my fears and amplified them to the point that it was causing waves of pain to travel throughout my body. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like she was an embodiment of fear itself. Run! Dennis yelled as loud as he could. She rushed at us with lightning speed, and we ran down the stairs like the building was on fire. When we reached the ground floor, we took a leap of faith and jumped out of a window frame with no glass present. Once we were outside, she didn't follow us. Is she gone? Dennis's face was white with fear. I took some deep breaths. It looks like it. Dennis pointed a trembling finger at the hospital. I'll tell you one thing, man. I'm never going in there again. At this point, we were soaked with sweat as we walked home, looking behind us every few seconds. And yes, we had nightmares. Who wouldn't after experiencing what we experienced? I'm not going to end this story by warning you not to explore abandoned asylums, as most people are just going to ignore me and continue to do so anyway. I am simply warning you to be cautious, because sometimes pursuing our hobbies can have some unexpected results. By the way, if it was any compensation, we did end up getting an A+ on a film project. To clarify, I never set out to work in corrections. I graduated from a private university with a degree in philosophy. I chose the school because of how the campus looked in fall, and I'd chosen the major because my girlfriend, at the time, wanted me to go into law. When the dust settled, I was back in my alpacan hometown, minus the girlfriend, plus $60,000 of debt, wondering how the hell I was going to scrape a life together. My family treated me like I was still a teenager, and it wasn't long before their silly rules and needling questions about my future grew too much to bear. I couldn't stand to see the smug, how the mighty have fallen faces of my conservative uncles over one more Thanksgiving dinner. I had to get out, and job sites were just smeared with listings for the local correctional facility. I was skeptical at first. The pay seemed too good to be true. My friends never missed a chance to regale me with horror stories about jail. Yet the HR people were friendly and helpful at my brief interview, and the facility seemed modern and professional. I had some moral qualms about working for a for-profit prison, but, like any sellout, I convinced myself that having $600 in the bank granted me some ethical wiggle room. On my tour, I learned that the complex had been built in the 1850s and had been plagued with scandal and corruption until, to quote the tight-bund, smartly dressed corporate rep said proudly, "It was bought by our company in the 70s and reformed. We run a very tight ship here." The overall effect, though, was a Frankenstein building. Shawshank Redemption by the way of Steve Jobs. When I tried to find architectural diagrams of the place, it was clear that it had been renovated and rebuilt so many times, no one was sure of anything really. The place sat on a twisted tentacular maze of pipes, basements, and dead corridors. Imagining those dank, lightless tunnels provided plenty of nightmare fuel on my first days. It was worse, and at the same time, not as bad as I'd feared. The prisoners were from a different world than mine, and they knew it. Getting a rise out of newbies like me was one of the few entertainment options in their sterile, sunlight-free world. On my first walk down the cell block, a Jamaican drug runner who'd shot 2 kids in a drive-by ran to his bars and spat blood at me, laughing as I spluttered and tried to wipe it off. I later learned he was HIV positive. On the other hand, my co-workers understood how difficult the first days could be and presented a pretty united front. As days went by, I came to understand the prisoners better too, their culture, how to interact with them, and the fact that they were humans like me. Things got so routine, to be honest, that I got a little bored. It was hard to socialize with the other officers. I had no interest in who won the game or how to keep a wife in line. I started just looking at things, trying to really see what was going on around me, and in this silent, solitary mode, I began to notice something strange. Power among prisoners is determined mostly by stature, either social stature in some gang, or because of some exploit or physical stature, as in the ability to beat the daylights out of someone. There was one guy in yard, though, who didn't fit the bill. A slight, tanned white guy, clean-shaven, with Godfather wrinkles and silver hair styled like a corporate executive's. Unlike the other cons, who would lift weights, huddle in circles gossiping or playing basketball, he would walk briskly around the yard or do some kind of methodical, yoga-like stretches. Sometimes he would just lay staring up at the clouds or mark in a little notebook he always carried. I thought prisoners weren't allowed to have pencils, but something about the guy made me keep my distance. Our Ice Age ancestors lived as prey for millennia, and now I think it may have been one of those instincts that kept me away from Dave. Whenever I asked him about it, everyone knew immediately who I was talking about. "Oh, that's Dave," came the reply, followed by a hasty, "Stay away from him." And that was where the information stopped. Any further inquiries were met with vague answers at best, or not so vague threats at worst. "You like having a job? You like having a face?" the CEO told me finally. "Then stop asking." I know I shouldn't have, but curiosity got the better of me. I waited until one of the computer terminals was unwatched and searched for Dave. Nothing came up. I searched his ID, his cell number, everything. It was like the man didn't exist. And in our metadata-driven world, that's quite an accomplishment. We amass huge dossiers and cons: crime, gang affiliations, sexual habits, next of kin, an NSA wet dream. There wasn't even a date for Dave's arrival here. I kept watching, and the more I watched, the stranger things got. It was a windy day in October, grey and dreary. Plastic bags, dead leaves, and junk writhed like hanged men in the double fences of the yard. Dave was squatting, alone, with his notebook out. I walked behind him on the pretext of doing my rounds, and I was amazed by what I saw. Dave had sketched a caterpillar with a skill like Da Vinci. On the opposite page was an illustration of a dandelion with the same artistic and scientific detail. Something about the way he shuffled made it clear he knew I was there. As I trudged away, I felt his electric blue, intelligent eyes burning into the back of my head. Brain boiling like a pot of worms, I thought, and had to stop the mad laugh building in my throat. The other prisoners stared. What was going on? I'd somehow lost several minutes. I was back at the gate to the yard. I felt tears on my face, cold in the biting wind. Later that week, I played sick to escape my duty during Dave's yard time and went to check out his cell. Technically, that was just as illegal as looking up his personal information, since Dave was in Block C and I worked in Block B. But I was obsessed. When I reached his cell, I found it had a door, like a science classroom's, not bars, and that my ordinary key wouldn't open it. The cell seemed normal, apart from the banned items in neat piles inside, books and accompanying notes in several languages, more sketches, a chalkboard and abacus, even candles. This was all in clear violation of regulations But then again, who would I report it to? My CEO had already made it crystal clear how he felt about discussing Dave. There was nothing to do but go back to my duty, with more questions than answers. When I returned to the yard the next day, the weather had cleared. The sun seemed to put all of us, cons and guards alike, in a good mood. The relaxed atmosphere gave me a lot of time to think about some of my recent decisions. Here, I was with a good job, good hours, finally getting a handle on life. And I was going to throw it away for some funny old man. I'd been stupid. It was just the time in life, I suppose, that made everything seem so odd and uncertain. I was caught up in my musings. I didn't realize that Dave was not among the other prisoners. I knew he was behind me before I turned. I moved with the dread of a child looking under his bed after a nightmare, but I hadn't expected to see him so close. Prison rules state that inmates maintain a certain distance from guards, and those rules are hard and fast. Yet Dave's face was less than an inch from mine. He stood there, grinning and chuckling his old man's laugh. Even then, I knew that laugh would echo in my dreams. I felt a scream welling up inside. Then burly arms were around me, pulling me into the bright fluorescent lights and away from the horror in the yard. I don't remember the stern lecture the CO gave me, or the IV drip in the med ward after, the hushed conversations of the nurses. I do remember laying in near paralysis on the Pepto-Bismol pink sheets, staring at a broom closet, waiting for it to open like a toothless mouth while everyone's backs were turned. Faint laughter would echo out. Then it would pull me in. When I woke, I called my worried family and muttered something about dizziness. I ate a sticky bun from the vending machine, barely tasting it or noticing the dark glances of my co-workers. It wasn't until I got home that I found a torn bit of yellow notebook paper in my pocket. It was a Da Vinci perfect sketch of me sleeping in my bed at home. When I compared that drawing to my bedroom at my parents' house, everything matched, from the coffee stain on the table to the pattern of the sheets. I lay all night with the lights on, listening to classic rock and trying to think of other things. After that day, it seemed that Dave and I had a sort of truce. I wouldn't pay him any undue attention, and he wouldn't, well, do anything further to me. I knew that I'd been let off with a warning, and not just from the CO. The nightmare stopped. I moved into a new apartment and started seeing a girl from OkCupid. Life, it seemed, was going back to normal, until Salvador Sweet Rodriguez showed up. Sweet had just been arrested at age 19 for shooting up a minivan to complete his gang initiation. In and out of juvie, this was his first day in big boy prison. He showed up with a wild, violent look in his black eyes. He was determined to make it clear that no matter how thin and handsome he was nobody's meat for the shower room, and a cheerful-looking old white man seemed like an easy target. By the time I got to them, it was too late. Dave had been staring at a dead tree, motionless apart from a slight rocking back and forth and the autumn breeze ruffling his hair. Sweet stalked over to Dave and snatched the pencil from the old man's loose grip, snapping it. "Do something, idiot," Sweet snarled. Stupid queer old peckerwood. 2 husky lifters, as well as all the guards, were running to save the loudmouth boy from himself. It was almost funny in a way, if not for the look in Dave's eyes. It reminded me of a man who finds a fly in his soup, trying to decide whether to eat it or not. A storm blew up that night. Everyone was on edge. The congenial mood we'd had earlier was gone. There was almost a riot when we ran out of grits, and the corridor rang with the sounds of angry prisoners hooting like animals and pounding on the bars. We'd broken up 3 fights already. I had been assigned to watch the cameras. I wasn't sure if it was my history with Dave or just my status as a newbie, but I was left alone in the main security hub, watching the CCTV feeds. I was hunched up, biting my nails, but couldn't say why I was so nervous. Around midnight, long after quiet hours, something came up that made me freeze. Surely I was seeing things. Frank DeWhittle, a hulking lifer who'd brutally castrated a paedophile with a lunch tray during my first week, was helping one of the guards carry Sweet Rodriguez down the central hall of Block B. Even if this wasn't a violation of every prisoner transfer protocol in the book, Sweet was obviously screaming his head off. I buzzed the guard. No response. No response from anyone. I could only watch as Sweet was dragged down from Block B to Block C, toward a tiny room with a door like a science classroom. I was running before I could stop myself, but when I saw the door to Dave's room closed, I knew I was too late. It did its job well, cutting off Sweet's screams just as they began. The con and the guard could have stopped me easily if they'd expected me to do what I did. I wouldn't have expected it myself. I snatched the key from my co-worker's hand and jammed it into Dave's cell door, shoving it open with my shoulder. Dave looked up from writings of Epicurus with a bemused expression, as though I were a dog that had padded into the room looking for a petting. And I knew that all that was left of Sweet Rodriguez was a few flecks of red at the corner of Dave's mouth. He looked up at me and smiled. "I'm working on a new sketch, you know." I was let go that evening. I went through the process in a daze. I didn't have the mental fortitude to put up a fight. I never went back, or even drove by the prison again. I got a job waiting tables at a local Applebee's. My buddy behind the bar let me polish off unfinished martinis until I'm finally drunk enough to sleep. But sometimes, I still wake up crying. Last year, my wife, Janice, and I were walking on the beach near our house. We've been married almost 20 years and still hold hands wherever we go. So my first awareness of the bottle was when she started racing ahead and dragging me across the sand. "Hey Matt, look at the size of that shell," she said, simultaneously blocking my view of it as she ran ahead. "Oh, wait, is that what I think it is?" "Probably, assuming you think it's a piece of trash." Janice let go of my hand to drop to her knees, allowing her skirt to pull around her on the stand. "It's not. It's a treasure. It's probably some homeless man's pea pot." Anyone who has been married knows exactly what look she gave me. Sort of a, "I've known you long enough that I don't have to pretend you're funny anymore" look. It really was a beautiful bottle though, despite the erosion and clinging barnacles countless years has stained its surface with. It seemed to be made of some type of ceramic, and the fat base was surrounded in intricate geometric designs. A leering face was carved into the neck, and a mouldy cork with a pungent smell was wedged in the top. Janice wasted no time trying to pry it open with her nails. "It looks like something that might have been on an old ship," she said, grunting with the effort like an offended farm animal. "How can you not be excited by this?" I shrugged, looking out to sea. I like to save all my excitement for the big things, like weekends and pizza night. Speaking of. But she had opened it now. She turned it over to shake the contents into her outstretched palm. I expected a rush of water and nothing else, but the thin, rolled parchment, which slipped out, was immaculately preserved. Janice unrolled it and studied the page. The wonder in her face gave way to amusement, then incredulity, her brow continuing to furrow into a bitter anger. "Well, don't leave me hanging. What's it about?" I asked. "I don't know. Ask your girlfriend." She shoved it against my chest and turned to stomp back toward our house without another word. Bewildered, I opened the letter and read. "Dear Matthew Davis, I miss you. I need you. How much longer will you make me wait? If your love endures as mine has done, what keeps you away from me?" "Janice, honey," I called, unable to tear my eyes away from the note. The paper, the bottle, even the smooth, archaic penmanship, all seemed ancient and untampered with. So what were the chances that it would be addressed to someone else with my name? My wife was already gone though. She didn't talk to me until late that night when I finally got frustrated enough to snap at her. It was either a coincidence or a practical joke played on me, neither of which were my fault. She wasn't convinced, but at least she opened up about her fear that I was cheating on her. She thought that someone hid the note near my house where I would find it as a romantic gesture. Eventually, she came around, but it was an uneasy peace at best. And it only got harder from there. There was another bottle almost every morning, wedged in the sand at the high tide line, as though it had washed up overnight. Sometimes my wife would find them, other times I would. I posted pictures online of a few of the bottles, and the closest match I was able to find were potions used by 17th century alchemists. That seemed like an important clue to me, but all my wife ever focused on were the notes. "The ocean ends, though we do not see it. The summer fades, though the sun seems unsaleable in the sky. Only our love will never grow old. I will not give up on you, Matt." Or, "How long has it been since we've made love? Do you still remember what it felt like to be with me?" Janice did her best to play it off as a joke, but I could tell that it was getting to her. She kept making excuses to spend more time alone, and when I pressed her to talk about her jealousy, she'd only treat it like an accusation and get defensive. We'd start fights over nothing, until by the end of the night, we were screaming at each other, and the next morning, not remember why. One night, all it took was me coming home late from work, and she was yelling before I even opened the car door. I couldn't take it anymore. I just slammed the car into reverse and left without a word, driving down to the beach to be alone. All the bottles were arriving within a 100-yard stretch, so I resolved to spend the whole night there until I caught whoever was really leaving them. Despite living within walking distance of the ocean, I'd never spent any time there after the sun went down. It's amazing how alien a familiar place can feel when night closes in. The gentle rhythm of the waves seemed less innocent somehow, like I was listening to some colossal creature slowly breathing beside me. The reflection of the moon cast strange shapes into the water, and the cresting of each black wave seemed like it was being distorted by unseen creatures just below the surface. I maintained my silent vigil until just after midnight, when the moon was masked by a thick layer of clouds. My phone had run out of batteries, and it was so dark that I don't think I would have seen someone drop the bottle 10 feet away. It would have been completely black if it weren't for the reflection in the ocean. I was getting ready to give up, or at least go back to the car and look for a flashlight, when a thought occurred to me. If the moon was completely obscured, how was its light still reflecting from the water? The longer I stared, the more sure I was that the light wasn't a reflection at all. The soft luminescence was coming from below the waves. I raced back to my car to check for the light, but I didn't find one. There was a snorkeling mask in the trunk though, so I took that instead and returned to the beach. I stripped to my underwear and took a step in. The water was ice around my ankles, and I almost turned around. But the light was even stronger now, and I was drawn like a moth to the flame. By the time the water reached my knees, my feet were so numb that I couldn't even feel them. The light was moving too, twisting and dancing like a living thing, 1 second drawing close, the next leading me out a little deeper. Deep breath before the plunge, I flung myself into the oncoming waves. The cold water closed over my head, but the thrill of my discovery made it feel like liquid energy washing over my body. The light was coming from a woman, shining out through her translucent skin. She was gracefully twirling through the water, her slightest movements propelling her more easily than a practiced stroke. At first, she looked like she was swimming, but as I drew closer, it quickly became apparent that all the movements were wrong. Her elbows and knees moved in unnatural, double-jointed arcs. Her neck appeared to have no bones at all, and it turned fluidly to track me independently of her turning body. In her right hand, she carried a bottle, just like the kind that had washed up on shore. If my mouth hadn't been full of water, I might have screamed. I also might have said, "Hello, Janice," and she might have said, "I've been waiting for you." I don't know how long I followed her for. She'd let me get almost close enough to touch her before drifting back just out of reach. I was mesmerized by the light and couldn't resist trying to get a better look. If it weren't for the eldritch radiance and the strange movements, I would have sworn it was Janice. And I thought, if I could only get close enough to catch her, then I'd know for sure. I was getting tired though, and stretching for the ground and feeling nothing, I suddenly realized how deep I'd actually swam. I surged to the surface in a panic. The lights of the houses and the shores were so far away that they looked like stars. I spun helplessly in place, trying to get a bearing of where I was, when a hand grabbed my ankle. She didn't try to yank me down. The caress was gentle, but as soon as I tried to pull away, her grip tightened. I felt her fingers climbing up my leg, the incessant pressure building like a constricting snake, slowly strangling its prey. I tried to start swimming back to shore, but the more I fought against her, the harder she pulled. A moment later, I was underwater again, bending double to vainly try and pry her hands off with my fingers. Water was flowing into my nose and mouth at this point, the bitter salt igniting my throat and flooding me with fresh waves of panic. The more I panicked, the harder I fought, and the harder I fought, the deeper down I was dragged. The last thing I remember was Janice wrapping her whole body around me, her limbs and spine completely encompassing me, as though she had no bones at all. I remember the icy waters giving way to numbness, then the suffocating pressure giving way to oblivion. It was early morning when I woke on my back on the beach. There was a bottle still clutched in my hands. "Can you forgive me?" it read. "I forgive you. As long as you visit me every year, I can wait a little longer for you to be mine again." Even when I went home, it didn't feel like home anymore. I found Janice's body lying in bed with nothing but an empty bottle of Jack Daniels and 2 empty containers of sleeping pills. I was sick of notes, but there was one left for me to read on my night table. "I saw you with her in the water, and I'll never forgive you." It's been a year since my wife died. Maybe when I go back down to the water to visit her again, she'll finally understand. It's only her that I've ever loved. I was the troublemaker in school. You know, there was always that one kid in class who never took any lessons seriously, who vandalized the classroom whenever the teacher wasn't there, who talked non-stop, despite the teacher's constant empty threats. That was me. I was very familiar with the principal by 3rd grade, whom I visited on average of 9 times per school week. My grades were low, as to be expected, but back then, I didn't care. When I say back then, I'm referring to my elementary school years, which were from 1997 to 2000, which is also where my story begins. I remember my 3rd grade teacher, Miss Darwin, who had recently suffered a divorce, and I took advantage of her at any moment I could. I would fail a test, and she would always give me sympathy points. I would throw an eraser at one of the girls, and I would be dismissed with a soft, "Stop, please." I recall with disdain my 4th grade teacher, Mr. Garrett, who would lower my grade by 10% every time I answered a question incorrectly in class. And then there was Miss Valerie, my 5th grade teacher. Miss Valerie was different from all the other teachers. Whereas everyone else saw me as a lost cause, she looked upon me with favour and affection. She would meet with me after class and review the material with me until she had made sure I understood it. She tutored me on weekends and motivated me to actually get work done. As you've probably guessed, my parents were rarely there for me, and she quickly became a motherly figure. I just wish I'd shown it. If anything, I was a worse student to Valerie than I was to Darwin or Garrett. I needed attention more than anything, and I think that, deep down, she knew it. Even as I talked out loud to my clique during class, even as I refused to turn in my assignments, even as I took 15-minute bathroom trips every day. I always felt guilty every time she reluctantly sent me down to the principal's office for detention, even though I wasn't conscious of it. And then, all of that changed. I think that most of you know what I'm talking about when I say that I especially hated those 20-year-old educational films. You know, the healthy eating and drug prevention campaigns that the school dropped on us for 1 month out of the year. Remember Dare? Yeah, that stuff. And the anti-bullying campaign. Jesus, that was torture. We spent the entirety of Fridays learning about how to stand up to bullies, how to not become a bully, how to speak up when you're a bystander. Of course, I never paid attention to any of it. They all consisted of grainy, low-quality scenes of people who were clearly on antidepressants talking about the problem of bullies in schools. They all had cheesy titles too. Don't stand by for bullying. Take bullying by the horns. I fell asleep during each and every one of them. I clearly remember that one March afternoon when Miss Valerie showed us a video simply entitled The Zebra. She inserted the tape into the VCR and told us that we should pay attention because the message was very important. She dimmed the lights and flipped on the TV. I wasn't awake for most of it, but what I did see was a bit confusing. It started with a cartoon scene of Africa, with no title sequence or anything. A poorly drawn zebra moved into view, coming across a pack of lions encircling an antelope. That's all I saw before I rolled my eyes, leaned back in my chair, and fell asleep. I was awakened by the voice of Valerie saying, "And that's why you shouldn't be a zebra. Any questions?" No one had any, but from what I'd heard at lunch that day, nobody fully understood it. Apparently, the zebra was supposed to represent a bystander. The lions were bullies and the antelopes was a victim. The plot was that the zebra watched as the lions devoured the antelope and didn't speak up to stop it. I couldn't have cared less about the message, but as the day went on, I became worried. Kids were dancing around the halls, singing happily. "We're not zebras, we're not zebras." When I threw erasers at the girls, they didn't react. It would hit their face and bounce off with a slap. But they just remained, unflinching, still singing, "We're not zebras," happily. It was strange, to say the least. Before I left school, I met up with Valerie for the usual review session. As I sat down in front of her desk, she asked me why I hadn't been watching the film. My answer was standard. I didn't care. Upon hearing this, she sighed heavily. "You know, Luke," she said, "I was once a lot like you. I would constantly cause trouble in class. I would even bully other students." That was when it wasn't criminal to be one, I thought. I often picked on this one very emotional, fragile little girl. I said the meanest things to her, awful things. I laughed as I watched her cry. She even stayed home for weeks at a time. One day, I got a call that the student I'd been harassing had killed herself by jumping from a window. I was too young to understand the gravity of this admission. That moment made me realize that the path I'd chosen was wrong and hurtful. I found out later that she had left me a gift. This video. She held up a copy of The Zebra. I never understood why, but I kept it knowing that changing would make her proud. And I say the same to you today. She put away the tape and looked into my eyes. Now go. She hadn't assigned anything to the class that day, and I assumed she would give me at least one extra credit paper. You're not giving me homework? I questioned. No, you can go home. I just wanted to tell you how I feel about your potential future, she said. I shrugged and left, seriously confused at the day's events. The next day, when I came to school, the entire class was empty. I sat down in my usual desk at the front of the room, looking at the absent desks around me. Seeing that nobody was there, I stood up and turned on the TV Valerie had kept for the PSA videos. The default channel was the local news. Breaking news: 17 children dead, cause unknown. I stared at the screen intently, not quite knowing what to think. 17 children were found dead this morning, all outside their own homes, said a reporter. The deaths were discovered by a paperboy who insisted on remaining anonymous, who claimed that he found several of them dead, lying on the ground below open windows on his morning route. Never before, since the town was founded, has there been such a tragic occurrence. The deaths were likely coordinated, although whether the intentions were homicidal or suicidal is still unknown. Police are currently investigating the incident. Shocked, I stood up and turned around to Miss Valerie standing at the doorway. You see why it's so important not to be a zebra now? She said, grinning. Of course you don't. She walked towards me. You are special. She strolled over to her desk and took out the zebra. These children have all stood up to the lions, and in doing so, they are no longer zebras. The antelope can be saved. She handed me the tape. I grasped it with both hands, as if it were made of glass. Despite being left in the cold metal drawer, it felt warm, as if it had been lying on top of a heater. There was something else strange about it, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The antelope was killed long ago by the lion. The zebras never batted an eye. But now, both the lion and the zebras have a chance to redeem themselves. The antelope, she chose me to spread the message of this video. Only a lion possesses enough strength to persuade the horde of zebras. Now, it's your turn. Before I could speak, Miss Valerie unsheathed a knife from her pocket and swiped it across her throat, falling over her desk in a heap. I've never screamed as hard as I did that day. Within minutes, the police stormed into the classroom looking for Miss Valerie. They found me crying next to a lifeless body, still clutching the tape. I couldn't understand what was happening. I still don't fully understand, if I'm honest. They told me that she was a bad person and that she was very sad. But as they confiscated the tape, I overheard them saying bits like, a known cultist, killed all 17, convinced somehow. After they calmed me down, I remember handing them the tape, saying that I wanted it back after they were done with it. Apparently that's not how it actually happened. An officer later told me that they had to pry it from me, and that I kept repeating one phrase over and over. I want to be a zebra. The case was concluded in late 2005, with the deaths confirmed as a mass suicide induced by Miss Valerie, who had a history of killing entire classes of children. Following its closing, the tape was returned to my possession, with the police officers claiming that it contained nothing of evidential interest. I knew that something about what was on it caused the death of my classmates. I had my theories: brainwashing, hypnosis, subliminal messaging, but I kept them to myself. I don't know why. I remember me taking it from them, feeling its familiar warmth, as if I was holding hands with an old friend, but I could never bring myself to rewatch it. There was something about it, something wrong. My therapist told me it was simply a connection to a traumatic event. I stopped going to his appointments years ago. At some point, I threw it in a desk drawer, and it gathered dust there for 12 years, until March 25th, the anniversary. I was spring cleaning, and I tipped over the desk, and there it was. I was tempted to pick it up and throw it into the furnace, but I restrained myself. I slowly leaned over and lifted it off the floor, brushing it off. I expected the label to be faded or worn, but it was eerily pristine. Not so much as a tear or crease. I could still see the words printed on it, appearing as though they were new. Studio 58 Productions presents The Zebra, an anti-bullying educational film. And then I realized something. That one thing I could never place when Miss Valerie had first given me the cassette. That one thing that had deterred me from watching it one more time. It was light. Too light for a cassette. The tape did not have, nor had it ever had, any film. On average, 16 people drown each year in the lake of Ozark, Missouri. The majority of the deceased are rarely recovered. The local authorities blame underwater currents, lack of water clarity, and wildlife for the inability to retrieve the corpses. However, what I experienced last winter has led me to believe something much more sinister is responsible. Last year, my parents purchased a construction condominium at the Lake of the Ozarks, and were the only residents at the time, as the other units were still being built and sold. The condo was only an hour and a half from my campus and was a perfect place to study for finals. It was paradise compared to my rundown college home. It had a king-sized bed, full kitchen, clean bathrooms, and most importantly, it was quiet. It was early December of last year. I had just finished packing up my car with dirty clothes and books, excited to have a weekend of peace and quiet before the last few days of final exams. Usually, one or two of my housemates would come with me, but they had already finished up for the semester and decided to spend the last few days partying before they had to head home for the holidays. This was a perfect excuse for me to retreat to the quiet condo. The throaty exhaust of my old Mustang roared to life on the first turn of my key, and I smiled. I was way too excited for my getaway. It was getting late as I hit the highway towards the lake. After an hour or so, I pulled off, hit the back roads, and decided to put the pedal down. I cracked the window, and the cold December air whistled past as I chased the sunlight. If I knew what was in store for me that weekend, I would have turned around and floored it back to campus. About 10 minutes later, I saw the dim, aqua-colored glow of the Blue Shore condominium sign cutting through the darkness. I shifted gears and pulled down the steep, hilly entrance, my headlamps the only source of light for miles. Just as I expected, The condominium parking lot was completely empty. I pulled into the front spot and parked. I stepped out of the warmth of my car into the frigid night air. The two-story complex would eventually have 5 units on each level. My parents' unit, the only occupied one at the time, was at the top corner, with only one neighbouring wall. I scaled stairs and walked into my second home, condo number 21. I pulled out my phone and used the screen to illuminate the door's keypad and typed in the code, my birth year. My parents were under the assumption that I would forget any other 4-digit combination, and they were probably right. I stepped inside and turned on the lights. The entrance led into the dining room, with the kitchen on the left and living room to the right. At the far end was the master bedroom, which had a large window that provided a beautiful view of the lake. Since I was on the second floor, I could see the black, moonlit water for half a mile. I made a frozen pizza and stood it for a couple of hours. It didn't take long for my relaxation to turn to exhaustion. I decided to take a shower and head to bed early, promising myself that I would wake up early and hit the books. I jolted awake in the middle of the night and looked at the bedside clock. 3:18 a.m. The cold wind howled outside as the sound of ice and snow brushed against the siding. I had completely forgotten to check the weather prior to leaving. I rubbed my eyes and slowly made my way to the kitchen for some water. I drank the glass and stood sleepily in the dark. Just as I turned to head back into the room, I heard the last thing I ever expected: the breaking of ice and the echoing sound of splashing lake water. I walked to the back window that overlooked the lake and stared into the vast darkness. My mind raced until I came to the eventual conclusion that the noise must have been a result of a fallen tree or unlucky deer trying to take a drink. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I zipped up my coat and stepped outside, pulling the door shut and hitting the lock button at the center of the keypad. I walked to the top of the stairs and peered down. There were footprints in the snow. Bipedal prints. They led from the edge of the lake to my car, turned, and disappeared once again at Lakeshore. It didn't make any sense, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I carefully walked down the stairs. The air was thin and quiet, the only noise coming from the crunching of my boots in snow. I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched as I made my way to the dock, turning and looking over my shoulder every few seconds. I cursed as I held my phone in the air, desperate for a signal. I had to tell someone, anyone. After what seemed like an eternity, one bar appeared. I dialed 911 as quickly as I could and held the phone to my face. It was no use. It was too weak. I had been gone for over an hour and decided to head back inside. It was considerably warmer now, and the snow on the asphalt had already begun to melt. I kept thinking to myself, had someone really jumped into the water last night? I did nothing but stare at the lake from the window and drink. I was too paranoid, and my mind raced for an explanation. Before I knew it, it was already midnight, and the alcohol had made me drowsy. I don't remember falling asleep. 3:09 a.m. I awoke to the unmistakable, horrendous sound of scraping against the metal of the front door. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, the only thing I could use as a weapon. I raced back to the door and leaned against it. My heart was beating through my chest. After a moment, I worked up the courage to look through the peephole. To my relief, I saw only the vacant space of the doorway. I sat back down on the cold, hard tile with my back against the door and knife clenched tightly in my hand. I stayed that way until the dim, morning light spilled through the windows. I got back up and checked the peephole. Everything seemed clear. I slowly unlocked the bolt and opened the door. I discovered what I feared the most. The footprints led straight to the door, which was now covered in deep, long scratches that ran its entire length. With my rear-wheel drive car and snow-covered hill as the only exit, I knew that I was stuck for the time being. I had to do something or tell someone. The door was my lifeline, my shield. I stayed in the condo most of the day, pacing around with my cell phone in an attempt to find a signal, too frightened to go outside, and cursing my parents for not installing internet yet. Eventually, I worked up enough courage. I knew I could potentially get a signal at the end of the dock. It had worked in the past. As I made my way to the dock, I followed the footsteps that once again led to the lakeshore. I got closer and examined them. They were unmistakably human, and despite the cold, reeked of lake water and rot. I stood at the edge of the dock with my phone, still unable to receive a signal. I decided to head back and barricade myself inside before dark. Just as I left the dock, I heard the faint sound of something large swimming just below the icy surface. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The hours flew by, and my eyes grew heavy. Before I knew it, I fell asleep with my head on the table. 3:02 a.m. The sound of pounding and splintering wood woke me up. I looked in horror as I quickly discovered what was happening. The door was being rammed. Adrenaline shot me up in the darkness. I didn't have much time. I ran to a closet and quietly closed it just as the front door burst open. I covered my mouth and my eyes filled with tears as I stared through the crack in the closet door. Something walked inside. It was too dark to make out any of the features. It walked with staggered, unnatural movements. The room instantly filled with the smell of putrid, decaying flesh as it took heavy, wet steps on the tile floor. As the figure moved deeper inside, towards the back of the condo, I made a break for it and ran out, jumping over to the front door. I fumbled with my keys and jumped in my car. The engine clicked as it refused to turn over. My eyes filled with tears as I worked the clutch and accelerator. On the third attempt, the engine finally turned over and roared to life. As I tore up the hill towards the main road, I checked the rearview mirror. The dark, massive figure stood a few feet from the building. I'd barely made it. I will never forget the inhuman scream it let out as I drove off. I reached cell service and through rambling hysteria, eventually informed my parents of all I had witnessed. My father contacted the local authorities and was told not to return to the condo until the police had investigated. We never returned. The building owner contacted my father a few days later with some bogus story about unexpected foundation issues and claimed that the entire project was to be demolished. He wrote my father a check for 3 times the value of the condo for our inconvenience. After what I experienced, I have drawn 2 possible conclusions. The first is that something otherworldly is responsible for the deaths and missing bodies, or those who are lost in the lake are far from dead. Over a decade ago, I boarded a plane and went to explore the grasslands, or savannas, of Africa. I'd just gotten out of school, and the idea of working with animals and observing their behaviour intrigued me to no end. I'd spend all night in a tiny apartment reading about encounters, attacks, and stories told by those native to the area. I was quite involved with an online group of people who shared the same interests as me. Some were professors, some were students, biologists, rangers, and so many more. That's where I met Trick. Well, his name is Patrick, but he hates when people call him that. Our friendship was instantaneous. Soon enough, we were planning a trip to Africa. I know, it seems wild and thoughtless, but I was 23 years old and adventurous. The world had so much to offer, and I wanted to experience it all. Together, we found a guy who was going to guide us and make sure we stayed within the correct perimeter. He knew the line where safe met dangerous and observation met attack. It wasn't a line we wanted to cross. Our guide's name was Han, and he was rugged and intimidating. Also, he smelled like gasoline, and we could never pinpoint why. The years wore his face down to tanned wrinkles and an adamant frown. "You two kids need to understand something," he'd said, and I remember the gruff, gravelly tone in his voice like I'd heard it yesterday. "My word, whatever I say will be what keeps you from getting killed." Sounded like he had an authority complex, but we shrugged and nodded along. He was the expert after all. The air was hot, feathering over my face, and the land seemed to stretch on forever. Trees were sparse, but the tall, wispy grass concealed the ground effortlessly. I remember feeling so small, so vulnerable. The sun drowned me in an intense heat, and sweat dripped relentlessly from every pore on my skin. While we set our stuff down in a well-built and sturdy tent, Han continued his speech. "We can go out in a few hours if you want to try see the lions hunt. They prefer to hunt at night." "Sounds good to me." I looked over at Trick, who seemed confident and excited. "Yeah, me too." Trick didn't shut up the entire time we got our stuff ready to head out. His voice wavered in eagerness, and he was practically bouncing off the walls of the tent. "Mikey, do you think we'll see anything tonight? Mikey, do you think they'll see us as their prey? Mikey, do you think you can stomach watching an animal get killed right in front of you?" The questions didn't stop until Han hastily pulled open our tent door. "Here." He threw a tightly wadded bag at us. "Those are some supplies you're gonna need." Cotton-scented candles?" I looked up to meet Han's eyes. "You'll see why. Don't question me on anything." "Lions must not like the smell of cotton," Trick joked. Han let out a humorous laugh. "It ain't just lions I'm trying to protect you from, kid." And with that, he swiftly left, calling out a 5-minute warning before we'd start our first journey. I'm not going to lie and say that Han's words didn't leave a pit of unease in my stomach. I rationalized by telling myself he meant other predators, like hyenas or something, though I admit I never heard of using a specific scented candle to ward off any species before. The tires on the Jeep cruised over the land easily, and the breeze dulled the sting of the setting sun. Orange painted the blue sky and left the land blanketed in shades of warmth. After a while, the sky darkened, and I saw more stars than I ever have before. God, those stars were beautiful. Pretty, ain't it? Han yelled over the engine. Yeah, I yelled back. Han continued driving, and I noticed Trick's comfortable posture on the other side of the Jeep. His arm hung out of the window, his hand waving against the wind. We pulled over, not too far behind a huge single tree. With binoculars, a defense weapon, a heavy jacket, and our damn candles, we set up beneath the protection of the trunk. Han sat between us, making sure to light every single candle until we were encircled. "Why did you choose this area to come to?" Han asked out loud. I'm not going to say the exact area we visited, for reasons you'll later understand. Well, I began, but Trick's voice overpowered mine. Lots of animal attacks here. Are the lions more aggressive? They seem to kill a lot of villagers around this area, more so than other areas. That's not why we came here, I added in defense, but they both ignored me. Han let out another laugh, and the sound sent chills down my entire body. In reality, this excursion was cheaper than any others we looked into, by a crap ton. Ain't no lion ever attacked no one out here. Both Trick and I began to speak up, but Han held up his index finger, silencing us. There's another predator out here. Even the lions don't mess with them. I told you when we first spoke on the phone that this place was dangerous, that you needed to listen to me, and everything would be fine, okay? I vaguely remembered the first conversation Trick and I had with Han. He made us agree to be completely compliant and to understand the risks of dangerous encounters before he agreed to being our guide. I didn't press him further, but instead muttered a weak, "Okay," before gluing my eyes to the binoculars. A long time passed with nothing, not even a word spoken in the cool air. The wind rustled the grass around us and flickered the flame ever so slightly. Then, as if someone had hit the mute button on a television, everything went dead quiet. Not the kind of quiet you think. I'm talking about a deafening quiet. No bugs, no sound of the wilderness around us. It was like we were in a vacuumed box. And the air felt still, similar the way the static built up before a terrible storm. My whole body felt rigid, like cardboard. Every hair stood on end. Part of me wanted to take off running. The other part tried desperately to listen to the sound of my beating heart. Han visibly tensed, his eyes serious as he looked at both of us. Softly but sternly, he whispered, "Don't leave this circle." He gestured to the candles that surrounded us. "Please." "What's out there?" Trick asked. Panic was obvious in his face. His hands trembled. Han stayed silent, taking in a shallow breath. The flames from the candles lit up a small space around us and brought attention to every detail in our worried faces. But the flames, wouldn't they attract attention to us? "Han," I began, "won't the fire—" "No." "What?" I started to ask, but he put his finger to my lips. "Listen." Han's face was focused, but something in his eyes looked almost happy, excited. I couldn't put a finger on it. It sounded like we all stopped breathing at once, and in the distance, we could hear the pounding of feet, like a stampede, but without the familiar sound of hooves. It was a deep thud, but rhythmic. I tried to swallow, but my mouth felt dry. With binoculars, I scanned the area to see what was approaching us, but couldn't see anything. I watched the grass, the way the blades melted into the black sky. I watched the horizon, the left, the right, panning over slowly until I saw them. They were blacker than the night sky, fast, skinny, and on all fours. The skin covering their visible bones looked wet, glossy. My stomach felt queasy, and the urge to sprint back to the Jeep was so intense I could barely keep myself grounded. My eyes were glued though. I couldn't look away. With every inhuman movement, quick and jumpy, my heart raced just a little bit faster. I knew my body was telling me to run, alerting me, trying to get me away from danger. But my mind told me to stay planted. Don't move. There were 3 of them. They ran around in jerky motions, but in a pack. They didn't look like any animal I had ever studied. I could see the way their muscles moved beneath a thin layer of skin, the way their bones seemed to stretch with every extension of their hind legs, like they were made of rubber. Then, suddenly, they stopped. All at once, they halted, and one stood, freaking stood on 2 legs. Its lips curled over curved, sharp, long teeth. It stretched its neck impossibly long, face looking towards the sky, and it sniffed the air. Shuffling started me, and I immediately looked over to Trick and Han. There was a horrified expression on Han's face, and the look of not just horror, not just betrayal, not just sadness, but pure dread. And I felt that all over me, from the tip of my hair to my toes. My heart dropped, and even the world felt slow, like a dream, no, nightmare, where time is morphed beyond comprehension. Trick was running toward the Jeep. I know he had seen them. His flight response had kicked in, and he bolted. The sound of his boots on the dirt were loud, excruciatingly loud, but nothing compared to the high-pitched scream that came from that thing. My eyes locked with Hans. The world sped back up, and I could hear them closing in on Trick. Not that they were very far anyway. I could feel my throat closing, my body burned, and at the same time, it felt so numb. The tickle from the tears in my eyes reminded me this was real, and I tried to focus on Hans' face as he mouthed to me in complete silence. Quiet. I put my hands over my mouth. The tears began to blur my vision. I blinked them away. The stars. He looked terrified. He looked desperate for me to be as still and as quiet as possible. Look at the stars. Focus on them. I did as he said, and stared above me. I counted them as Trick's ear-splitting scream tore across the savannah. I tried so hard to keep my eyes fixed on the shapes the stars made. Don't look. Don't run. The sound of his screams turned into cries. The snapping of his bones echoed and popped. The ripping of his muscles and the blood-curdling chokes for air settled in every particle of my body. It's a sound I'll never forget. There's a dog in the stars. My eyes traced the shape of its tail. I stared at it until my head began to throb. It felt like hours had passed before the sounds stopped, before the screams died down, and the sound of chomping and chewing dissipated. The heavy smell of cotton overpowered the stench of blood. I don't even remember walking back to the Jeep. I definitely don't remember the sun coming up. I don't remember when the sound of grass swaying came back to life, and I don't remember the ride back to the tent. I do, however, remember the faint splash of blood that covered a tiny part of the ground. That was all that was left of him. I remember Han reporting another lion attack to the locals. I remember the numbness that covered my mind and body. I could hear Trick's voice. It played like a recording in my mind. I never asked why. I never asked Han why he brought us out there knowing what could happen, or why he didn't warn us. Part of me blames myself. Part of me blames him. I never asked him why the scent of cotton, specifically, was what covered our scent the best. My only guess is trial and error. I try not to think about it too much, but I relive it every night in my head. I try to forget and move on, but I simply can't. Could you? And I try to keep my story straight whenever anyone asks me why I hate anything to do with the stars.